She had done this exact thing 100 times before. Packed a bag, checked the time, locked the front door behind her, and headed to the airport the way most people head to the grocery store, routinely, without drama. Without any particular feeling about it except maybe the small tiredness that comes from waking up earlier than your body would like. Dorothy was 52 years old, and she had been moving through the world quietly and carefully for every single one of those years. She was not the kind of woman who drew attention to herself. She was not the kind of woman who caused problems. She was, by every measure that the people who knew her would use, one of the most straightforward and decent human beings you could ever have the luck of knowing. She worked as a hotel housekeeper in Birmingham, Alabama, a job she had held for 19 years at the same property, under 3 different managers, through 2 renovations and 1 full rebranding. She knew which rooms had the squeaky carts. She knew which floors had the slow elevators. She knew the names of every single person on the housekeeping team, including the newer ones who had only been there a few months, and she remembered their children's names too. That was just who she was. A woman who paid attention to people. A woman who showed up. The trip to Houston had been her sister's idea. Her younger sister had just moved into a new apartment after years of a difficult situation that the family had been quietly worried about. And she wanted Dorothy to come see the place, to sit at the new kitchen table and drink coffee and just be there the way sisters are there for each other when words aren't quite enough. Dorothy had put in the time off request 3 weeks in advance, the same way she did everything, properly, without fuss, giving her supervisor enough notice to arrange coverage. She had packed light. 1 carry-on bag, the kind with the hard shell, and the 2 front pockets, dark blue. Nothing remarkable about it. She had her reading glasses in her purse, a book she had been slowly working through for about a month, a small bag of almonds because airport food was expensive, and she was practical about money the way people are when they've earned every dollar carefully. She wore comfortable clothes because she was a practical woman and flights were long enough without adding discomfort to them. Dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse, a cardigan because the terminals were always cold. She looked like exactly what she was, a middle-aged woman traveling alone, heading home after a few days away, carrying nothing more complicated than a little bit of tiredness and a heart that felt good from having spent real time with her sister. The visit had gone beautifully. That was the thing Dorothy kept coming back to later, when the whole nightmare was behind her and she finally had the space to think clearly again. The visit had been exactly what she needed. Her sister had cooked on the first night, a big pot of the same stew their mother used to make, and they had sat at that new kitchen table and talked until almost midnight, catching up on the years that had been hard and letting the good feelings of the present moment do their slow work of healing. Dorothy had slept better in Houston than she had in months. She had gone to a small church with her sister on Sunday morning and felt the particular peace that comes from sitting in a room full of people who are all reaching toward the same thing. She had walked around her sister's neighborhood in the early morning before the heat came up and felt genuinely, simply happy. By the time Tuesday came and it was time to go home, she was carrying that happiness with her the way you carry something good, lightly, gratefully, not wanting to squeeze it too hard in case it slipped away. She got to the airport in plenty of time. She always did. Being late to things caused her a particular kind of anxiety that she had long ago decided was simply not worth it. So she built extra time into everything. She checked in at the kiosk without any issues, moved through the first security checkpoint the same way millions of people move through airport security every single day. Shoes off, bag on the belt, arms up in the scanner. Collect your things on the other side. Keep moving. Nothing flagged. Nothing unusual. She found a seat near her gate, ate a few of her almonds, and opened her book. Her flight was boarding in about an hour. She was thinking about the drive home from Birmingham Airport, about whether she should stop at the grocery store on the way or wait until the next morning, about ordinary things, small things, the kind of things that fill a person's mind when life is going normally and there is nothing to worry about. She had no reason to think that anything was about to happen. There was no feeling, no warning, no small voice telling her to brace for something. Life was quiet. She was just a woman sitting near a gate, reading a book, waiting to go home. The two officers appeared in the way that things appear when you're not watching for them. Suddenly, and all at once, they walked directly toward her section of the seating area. And at first, Dorothy didn't even register that they were coming to her specifically, because why would she? She looked up from her book and looked back down and then looked up again because they had stopped. Right in front of her. One of them said her name, asked if she was her, confirmed the seat number on her boarding pass, and asked her to come with them. Just like that. No explanation beyond routine additional screening. Dorothy closed her book. She put it in her bag. She stood up, because what else do you do when law enforcement asks you to stand up in a public place? She was calm. She was cooperative. She told herself it was nothing, a random check, the kind of thing that happened to people all the time and meant nothing. She went with them because she was a law-abiding woman who had nothing to hide and no reason to make anything harder than it needed to be. Took her to a section of the terminal that felt more exposed than anywhere. She had been so far wide open, highly visible. The kind of space where everything that happens is seen by everyone passing through. And then the dogs came. Not one, not two, 14. 14 animals with 14 handlers, surrounding her carry-on bag and circling the space around her in a way that stopped people in their tracks. Travelers slowed down. A family with young children stopped walking entirely. People pulled out their phones. Dorothy stood in the center of all of it, her hands clasped in front of her, her face carefully still, and she felt something that she later described as the loneliest feeling she had ever had in her life. Not fear exactly, though fear was there too. More than fear. It was the particular loneliness of being made into a spectacle in front of hundreds of strangers who did not know her name or her story or the 19 years of quiet, honest work or the stew her sister had made, or the church on Sunday morning, or any single thing that made her who she actually was. To every person watching, she was just a woman surrounded by dogs in an airport terminal, and there was nothing she could do in that moment to be anything more than that dog. She answered every question they asked her. She opened her bag when they told her to. She stood where they told her to stand. She did not cry, though the pressure behind her eyes was real and heavy and asked her more than once to let it go. She held herself together with the kind of quiet dignity that takes enormous strength and gets very little credit because it looks, from the outside, like simply standing still. 2 hours passed. The dogs found nothing. Her bag contained exactly what it contained: clothes, a book, reading glasses, almonds, and the small, ordinary evidence of a woman who had been visiting her sister and was trying to get home. No explanation was offered for why it had started. No apology was given for the 2 hours or the 14 dogs or the hundreds of eyes that had watched the whole thing. They handed her bag back and told her she was free to go. Her flight had already boarded. She was the last one on the plane. She sat down in her window seat and looked out at the tarmac and finally, quietly, let the tears come. The plane was mostly full by the time Dorothy made it to her seat. People had settled in, bags were overhead. Conversations were already happening in that low, comfortable murmur that fills a cabin before takeoff. Nobody on that plane knew what had just happened to her in the terminal. Nobody looked at her twice. She was just a woman who had boarded late, slightly out of breath, finding her window seat and tucking her carry-on under the seat in front of her because she didn't want to hold anyone up reaching for the overhead bin. She sat down and turned her face to the window and watched the ground crew moving around on the tarmac below, small and purposeful in their orange vests, and she breathed. Just breathed. In and out, slow and deliberate, the way she had taught herself to breathe through hard moments over the course of 52 years of having them. The tears she had let go of in those first few minutes after sitting down had dried by the time the plane pushed back from the gate. She wiped her face carefully with the back of her hand and straightened in her seat and made herself look forward instead of back. Because looking back at something you cannot change is a particular kind of suffering that Dorothy had learned, at great personal cost, was simply not worth the energy. But her mind would not entirely cooperate. That was the honest truth of it. She tried to read her book and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. She tried to look out the window at the clouds and found her thoughts pulling her back to the terminal, to the moment the dogs appeared, to the faces of the people who had stopped to watch. She kept thinking about one face in particular, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, holding her mother's hand, staring at Dorothy with wide, uncertain eyes. Not mean eyes. Just confused eyes. The eyes of a child trying to understand what she was seeing and not having the context to make sense of it. Dorothy had smiled at her, instinctively, the way she smiled at children without thinking about it. And the little girl had not smiled back, just kept staring. And her mother had gently turned her away and kept walking. Dorothy didn't know why that specific moment was the one that stayed with her above all the others. Maybe because children are honest. Maybe because that little girl's confusion was the purest mirror of what the situation actually was. Something that didn't make sense. Something that had no good explanation. Something that a person with an innocent mind could look at and immediately recognize as wrong, even without the vocabulary to say so. She landed in Birmingham just after 2 in the afternoon. The drive home was quiet. She had parked in the long-term lot, and she walked to her car slowly, her carry-on rolling behind her. The October air cool and carrying the particular smell of her city that she had never been able to fully describe to anyone but always recognized. Instantly, something like cut grass and red clay and the faint sweetness of somebody's dryer vent on a residential street. She drove home through familiar roads, past the church she attended, past the grocery store she had been debating about stopping at, past the school where she had volunteered every 3rd Saturday for the last 4 years, helping with the reading program. She knew this city. This city knew her in the quiet, accumulative way that cities know the people who love them faithfully and without fanfare. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the parked car for a few minutes before going inside. She didn't know why. She just wasn't quite ready to be home yet. Home was normal, and what had happened today didn't feel like it belonged in the same world as normal. She called her sister that evening. She had gone back and forth about it because she didn't want to upset her. The visit had been so good, so healing, and Dorothy didn't like the idea of dropping something heavy into the warm memory of it. But her sister picked up on the second ring and asked immediately if she had made it home all right. The way sisters do when they have a particular attunement to each other's moods, even through a phone screen. And Dorothy said yes, and then paused, and her sister said, "What happened?" And Dorothy told her. All of it. The officers appearing. The dogs. The 2 hours. The staring strangers. The little girl with the wide eyes. The boarding lost and sitting down and crying into the window. She told it plainly, without dramatizing, the same way she did most things. And when she finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line that had a very specific weight to it. The weight of someone who loves you trying to hold their reaction together because they know that falling apart on your behalf, right now, is not what you need. Her sister said, "You did nothing wrong." And Dorothy said, "I know." And her sister said it again, louder. You did absolutely nothing wrong. And Dorothy said, I know that too. But knowing a thing and feeling a thing are two entirely different experiences. And they both understood that without having to say it. What Dorothy did not know, could not have known. Sitting in her kitchen that Tuesday evening with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her, was that something had already been set in motion out in the world that was entirely beyond her control. Because one of those hundreds of people who had stopped and stared in that terminal had not just stared. A young woman, 21 years old, a college junior home for a long weekend, waiting for a flight back to her university, had watched the entire encounter from the moment the dogs appeared to the moment Dorothy walked away toward her gate. And this young woman, who had grown up in a household where her grandmother talked constantly about the importance of bearing witness, about how silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of participation, had taken out her phone within the first 30 seconds and pressed record. She had filmed carefully and steadily for the full duration, not drawing attention to herself, not narrating loudly, just quietly documenting what was in front of her. She had captured the dogs circling. She had captured Dorothy standing with her hands clasped, utterly still and dignified. She had captured the officers going through the bag. She had captured the long wait. And she had captured the moment it ended, the bag handed back, no explanation, no apology. Dorothy walking away, through the terminal alone while the officers moved on to whatever came next for them as if nothing particularly significant had occurred. The young woman had sat with the footage for almost an hour before posting it. She had thought about it seriously, the way a person thinks about something when they understand that what they do next has real consequences, and they want to get it right. She had trimmed it carefully. She had written a caption that was factual and calm, that described only what she had witnessed without embellishment, because she understood instinctively that the footage was powerful enough on its own, and that adding anger or accusation to the caption might give people a reason to argue about the framing instead of looking at what was actually there. She posted it to her social media account, which had a few hundred followers, mostly classmates and family and people from her hometown. She did not expect much. She hoped a few people would see it. She thought maybe it would reach a few thousand if she was lucky. She put her phone in her bag and boarded her own flight by the time her plane landed, 2 hours later, and she turned her phone back on. The notifications had stopped being individual and started arriving in a continuous, unbroken flood. The video had been shared 8,000 times in the first hour. It had been picked up by 3 large accounts with significant followings who had reposted it with their own commentary. It had been clipped and reshared across multiple platforms simultaneously. By midnight, it had 4 million views. By the following morning, that number had more than doubled. News producers were in her inbox. A reporter from a national outlet had tracked down her university email. The caption she had written so carefully, factual, calm, just the facts, was being quoted back across the internet in thousands of conversations, in dozens of languages, on every platform that existed. And Dorothy, who had gone to bed that Tuesday night with a cold cup of tea and the quiet, exhausting weight of a day she hadn't asked for, woke up on Wednesday morning to a phone full of missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and the slow, disorienting realization that her ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday had somehow become something the entire world was now talking about. Dorothy was not a woman who slept with her phone on the nightstand. She had made that decision years ago, deliberately, after reading something about how the brain needs genuine rest and not the half-sleep that comes from keeping one eye on a glowing screen all night. Her phone charged on the kitchen counter across the apartment, and she slept in actual silence the way people used to sleep, before the world decided that being unreachable for 8 hours was somehow irresponsible. So when she woke up on Wednesday morning and padded into the kitchen in her robe and her slippers and picked up her phone to check the time. She was not prepared for what was on the screen. Not even close. The missed calls were the first thing she noticed, 17 of them. From numbers she didn't recognize, area codes she didn't know, mixed in with 3 from her sister and 2 from a cousin she hadn't spoken to in months. Then the text messages, which had stacked up so many that her phone had stopped notifying her individually and was simply showing a number and a small red circle that kept climbing while she stood there staring at it. Then the emails, which she almost never got in volume because she was not a person with a large online presence. She had a basic account she used for work correspondence and the occasional online order and not much else. She stood in her kitchen in the early morning, quiet, and looked at her phone and felt the specific, vertiginous feeling of a person who has stepped onto solid ground and found it moving unexpectedly beneath their feet. Her sister had left a voicemail at 11 the previous night, and Dorothy listened to it first because her sister was the person she trusted most in the world, and whatever her sister had to say felt like the right place to start. The voicemail was short, but her sister's voice in it was doing the careful, controlled thing it did when she was trying not to alarm anyone. She said that a video had been posted online. She said it was of Dorothy at the airport, and that it had spread very far very fast, and that Dorothy needed to know about it before she heard it from somewhere else. She said she loved her and to call as soon as she was awake. Dorothy set the phone down on the counter and stood very still for a moment. She made herself a cup of coffee first. She did it slowly and deliberately, measuring the grounds, filling the water, waiting for it to brew, because she had learned over 52 years that the instinct to rush toward alarming information is almost always wrong, and that 2 minutes of stillness before a hard thing is never wasted. She sat at her kitchen table with her coffee, and then she picked up her phone, and she found the video. It took her less than 10 seconds to understand what she was looking at. The angle was from somewhere to her left, slightly elevated. Probably a person sitting on one of the terminal benches with their phone held at chest height to avoid drawing attention. The footage was steady and clear. She watched herself standing in that open space in the terminal, her hands clasped in front of her, her face still and composed, the dogs moving around her bag, the officers talking to each other and occasionally to her. She watched the whole thing from the outside for the first time, and it was one of the strangest experiences of her life, watching yourself in a moment that you lived through from the inside, seeing what you looked like to everyone else while it was happening. She looked smaller on the screen than she felt in her memory of it. She looked very alone. She watched herself stand there for 2 full hours in that footage, patient and cooperative and dignified. And she felt a complicated rush of things that she couldn't have separated into neat categories even if she'd tried. Something like sadness. Something like pride in herself for holding it together. Something like anger that holding it together had even been necessary, and underneath all of it, something very quiet and very tired that didn't have a name. She called her sister. Her sister picked up before the first ring had finished, which meant she had been awake and waiting, which meant she had barely slept, which was exactly the kind of thing her sister did when she was worried about someone she loved. They talked for a long time. Her sister had spent part of the night reading through the comments on the video, which Dorothy had not done and was not sure she was ready to do. And she told Dorothy that the vast majority of them were from people who were outraged on her behalf, people who were angry, people who were calling for accountability, people who were sharing their own stories of similar experiences in airports and train stations and shopping centers and streets. An avalanche of recognition from strangers who had never met Dorothy, and never would, but who saw themselves in what had happened to her. There were other comments too, her sister said carefully. The kind that exist in every corner of the internet where something like this surfaces. The kind that look for reasons to explain away what is plainly visible and make it smaller than it is. Dorothy told her sister she didn't need to hear about those. Her sister agreed immediately. Some things are not worth your time, and both of them had known that long enough to meet at dot by 9 in the morning. Dorothy had been contacted by 2 television news producers, a reporter from a national newspaper, and a woman who identified herself as a civil rights attorney who had been following the video since the previous evening and wanted Dorothy to know that she had options and that she didn't have to navigate whatever came next alone. Dorothy wrote down the attorney's number carefully on the notepad she kept by the phone, the same way she had written down important numbers her whole life, deliberately, with good handwriting, so there was no question about it later. She was not impulsive. She was not going to make any decisions in the first 24 hours about anything, because she had seen enough of life to know that the decisions made in the heat of a moment are often the ones you spend the most time undoing afterward. She thanked the attorney and said she would be in touch. She did not return the calls from the news producers yet. She was not ready to be on television. She was not sure she would ever be ready to be on television. She was a hotel housekeeper from Birmingham who liked to read and volunteer at the school reading program and cook large amounts of food to bring to neighbors who were going through hard times. She was not a public figure. She had not signed up for any of this, but the world does not always wait for you to sign up. That was the thing Dorothy was slowly, uncomfortably coming to understand as Wednesday morning moved into Wednesday afternoon and the calls kept coming and the video kept spreading and the story kept growing in the way that certain stories grow when they hit something true and universal that millions of people have been carrying quietly and individually and suddenly find reflected back at them from a screen. By midday, the video had been viewed over 8 million times. A prominent civil rights organization had issued a public statement referencing Dorothy's experience and calling for a formal investigation into screening procedures at the airport. 3 separate members of Congress had mentioned the video in public statements. The airport authority had released a brief, careful, deeply unsatisfying comment saying they were reviewing the matter internally, the kind of language that is specifically designed to sound like action while committing to nothing, and that almost everyone who read it recognized immediately for exactly what it was. Dorothy read the airport statement on her phone while sitting at her kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and felt a flicker of something that surprised her a little by its intensity. She was not generally an angry person. She had built her life around patience and practicality and the quiet satisfaction of doing her work well and taking care of the people around her. But reading those carefully chosen, commitment-free words from an institution that had put her through 2 hours of public humiliation without a single explanation or apology, reading the smoothness of it, the practiced blandness of it, the way it was engineered to close a door rather than open one, she felt something harden in her chest in a way that was unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome. She picked up the notepad with the attorney's number on it. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she picked up her phone and dialed. The attorney's name was Patricia Owens, and she had been practicing civil rights law for 26 years, which meant she had seen enough to be unsurprised by almost anything and angry about all of it anyway. She was based in Atlanta, about 2 hours from Birmingham, and when Dorothy called her that Wednesday afternoon, she picked up herself, not an assistant, not a receptionist, but the woman herself, which told Dorothy something immediately about the kind of person she was dealing with. They talked for nearly an hour on that first call. Patricia asked questions the way doctors ask questions during a thorough examination, carefully, methodically, leaving no gap unfilled, circling back to things Dorothy had already mentioned to make sure she had the complete picture and not just the outline of it. She asked about the sequence of events in precise order. She asked what exact words the officers had used. She asked whether Dorothy had been given any documentation, any written record of the stop, any official paperwork at all. When Dorothy said no, Patricia was quiet for a moment in the specific way that lawyers are quiet when they hear something that matters. Then she asked one more question, slowly and clearly. She asked whether Dorothy had noticed, at any point during the 2 hours, any other travelers being pulled aside for similar screening in that same area. Dorothy thought about it carefully and said no. Just her. In 2 hours of standing in that open terminal space, not a single other person had been brought into that area. Patricia said, "All right," in a tone that meant considerably more than the word itself, and told Dorothy that she wanted to meet in person as soon as possible, and that Dorothy should not speak to any media, not a single outlet, until they had sat down together and talked everything through. Dorothy said she understood. She meant it. They met on Friday morning at a small office in a building just off a quiet street in Atlanta. The kind of office that is not decorated to impress anyone, but is clearly the workspace of someone who does serious work. Bookshelves covering entire walls. Files organized with a precision that spoke of long habit. A desk that had seen decades of difficult conversations. Patricia was a compact woman in her early 60s with natural, gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to conserve their energy for what actually matters. She shook Dorothy's hand firmly and looked at her directly and said, "Before anything else, I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong. Not complicated, not debatable. Wrong." Dorothy had heard versions of that sentiment from her sister and her cousin and several strangers on the internet over the past few days, and she had appreciated every single one of them. But hearing it from this woman in this room, with the weight of 26 years of this specific kind of work behind it, landed differently. It landed like something solid in the middle of ground that had felt uncertain all week. Patricia had already begun her own preliminary research before Dorothy arrived, because that was simply how she operated. She did not wait for the full picture to start looking for the frame. What she had found in those 2 days of quiet digging was enough to make the meeting feel less like an intake conversation and more like the beginning of something that had already been building long before Dorothy ever set foot in that terminal. The airport in question, it turned out, had a complaint history that was both troubling and remarkably consistent. Patricia had located, through public records requests she had filed years earlier in unrelated cases and never fully followed up on, a pattern of formal complaints from travelers who described experiences that rhymed uncomfortably with Dorothy's. People pulled aside, held for extended periods, no contraband found, no documentation provided, no apology given. The complaints spanned an 18-month window. They came from people of similar backgrounds traveling alone, and every single one of them had been logged, acknowledged with a form letter, and then filed somewhere that was clearly designed to be a destination rather than a starting point. Filed and forgotten. Or not forgotten exactly, more like deliberately set aside. The way you set something aside when you hope that enough time will pass that nobody comes looking for it. Dorothy listened to all of this with her hands folded on her lap and her face calm. The same face she had worn in the terminal, and Patricia watched her carefully the way she watched all her clients when they were receiving information that had the potential to overwhelm, looking for the signs of a person starting to go under. But Dorothy did not go under. She absorbed. She asked a precise question about the complaint process, specifically whether the people who had filed those earlier complaints had been informed about each other, whether any of them knew they were not alone in this. Patricia said no. They had each filed individually, in isolation, with no knowledge that others had done the same. Dorothy was quiet for a moment and then said, very softly, "That's the saddest part of all this." And Patricia looked at her and nodded slowly, because it was. And because not every client she had ever sat across from would have identified that as the center of it so quickly. The officer who had initiated Dorothy's detention had a name in the official incident report. And that name had a file attached to it that Patricia had been building a picture of through the week. She was careful about how she presented this part, because she was a precise woman who did not deal in accusations she could not support with documentation. And she wanted Dorothy to understand the difference between what was confirmed and what was still being established. What was confirmed was that this officer had been the subject of previous formal complaints. Not one, not two, but several, filed by different travelers over a period that predated the 18-month complaint window by an additional year. What was also confirmed was that those complaints had been reviewed internally and that the officer had continued in the same role without any documented change in assignment or protocol. What was still being established was the full chain of who had reviewed those complaints, who had made the decision to keep things as they were, and how far up the institutional structure that decision had traveled. That last part, Patricia said carefully, was the part that was going to take time. But she said it with the confidence of a woman who had taken time before and had not been disappointed by what it eventually produced. Dorothy drove home from Atlanta that Friday afternoon feeling something she had not expected to feel when she woke up on Wednesday morning, staring at a phone full of missed calls. She felt purposeful, not powerful, not righteous, not any of the bigger and louder things that people sometimes perform in the middle of situations like this. Just purposeful. The quiet, grounded sense that she was moving in a direction that was right, and that the moving itself mattered regardless of how far it eventually went. She had not asked for this. She had not wanted to be anyone's story. She had wanted to go home from Houston and stop at the grocery store and sleep in her own bed and go back to work on Thursday and live the ordinary, decent life she had built carefully over 5 decades. That was all she had wanted. But the thing had happened anyway. And the question that she had been sitting with all week, the question of what a person does when something happens to them that they didn't choose and cannot undo, had found its answer gradually and quietly over the course of that Friday meeting in Patricia's office. You don't let it be only about you. That was the answer. You take the thing that was done to you in an empty, impersonal, institutional way, and you make it personal in the best sense of the word. You make it about the people who filed complaints alone and heard nothing. About the little girl with the wide eyes who saw something she couldn't explain. About the 18 months of patterns that had been carefully buried by people who understood that buried things stay buried only as long as nobody decides to dig. Patricia filed the formal legal complaint the following Monday. By Tuesday, it had been picked up by 3 major news outlets. By Wednesday, the airport authorities carefully worded, reviewing the matter. Internally, statement had been replaced by a significantly longer and noticeably more nervous public response that used the word accountability 4 times without once defining what that would actually look like. Dorothy read it at her kitchen table the same way she had read the first one, with her coffee in the morning quiet, calmly, and this time what she felt was not the hardening anger of Wednesday, but something more measured and more durable. The door had opened. It was only a crack. But she had learned from 52 years of living that cracks are where the light begins. And that the people who made the crack, however quietly, however reluctantly, had started something they were not going to be able to finish on their own terms.